Hey everyone, welcome to the video. This one we are lineup building for week 15 of the NFL season on Draftkings. This is my favorite video I put out every single week. We did the core plays video on Wednesday. We did the top value plays video on Friday. So now we can apply all of the content I already put out and we can apply it into a cash game lineup build. And if you haven't checked out the core plays video or the top value plays video yet, I'd recommend watching that one first before you watch this one. Probably won't, but I definitely recommend it just to have a better understanding of the guys that we are going to talk about already. And the purpose of this video, it's not just for me to give you guys a lineup to use in all of your contests. I don't recommend that at all. This is just me going over my cash game lineup building process to help identify guys that are going to be extremely high owned, have pretty safe floors, decently high ceilings, good matchups, and are benefiting from injury news. And you can use the same process into some of your favorite plays, because I know I don't have all the favorite plays that you guys have. It's okay to disagree on some plays. So you can use this same process that I'm using into your own lineups and help build a good, solid cash game lineup. Anyway, guys, before we continue, if you guys could leave a like, and if you're new to the channel, please hit that subscribe button. Really helps me out. Really appreciate it. I think we got 3K. I think it was like at 299. 29999 when I started recording, so we probably hit it. So thank you guys very much. That is awesome. I appreciate all the support on this channel. And if you want to follow me on Twitter, I'm at ChrisPennell16. And if you're interested in the spreadsheets I build every single week for the NFL season, I'll have my cash game rankings on there, my cheat sheet, projections, my Discord chat. All that's available in the link in the description below for my Patreon. I also do NBA every single night, and that's been going very well this season. So yeah, without further ado, I say we get right into the video because that's why you guys are all here. It was probably like a 2 or 3 minute intro, so I apologize. But anyway, let's get into this cash game lineup build. So the guy I want to probably start my cash game lineups off this week is someone I'm rising on. He was in my value plays video, and he was originally not my core plays video. But the more I think about it, the more it makes sense. So I'm going to plug in Kyler Murray for my cash game lineup as of right now at 5,600. And he just makes a little bit too much sense this week. And I actually do believe he's going to be flirting with being the chalk quarterback this week. Honestly, I think he's got a good chance of being the highest owned quarterback this week. But I totally get it. He actually grades out as a top value play at the quarterback position on my sheet. So if my own sheet likes it, and everyone else likes it, I think something's lining up here. So Kyler Murray does make a ton of sense. This game does feature a 49-point over-under, which is second highest on the slate. So it makes a ton of sense to want exposure to it, especially a quarterback that's below 6K in a really nice game environment like this. I know we had the Titans and Texans game that's got over a 50-point over-under. Both of those quarterbacks are above 6,500, so that also gives me a little bit of cautious there. Not cautious, but caution, you get it. But anyway, because for those guys to really pay off salary, they're going to have about 3 touchdowns, near 300 yards, which they can definitely do because that's an excellent game environment. I love those guys in GPPs, and I like them in cash too. I just think the path for Kyler Murray hitting value is much easier than those guys. That's another thing I like about Kyler, and also just like buying people low. This is the second cheapest he's been all season. The last time he was this cheap, I believe, was week 2, and then week 1, I believe it was his cheapest because it was his first start of the NFL career. And I know he's had a rough 2-game stretch here, but before that, 26 points, 30 points, 23 points, and those were 2 of those were really tough matchups. San Francisco twice, which we know is a gauntlet for fantasy quarterbacks, running backs, receivers, whatever. Tampa Bay, much easier matchup, had 30 points. Then he had the 10 points versus New Orleans, which is a tough matchup. 6 points versus New York, which sometimes things just happen. And Chase Edmonds took over that game, really didn't need to do much because Edmonds was just destroying the world there. Had 6 fantasy points. Then 31 versus Atlanta, 25 versus Cincy, 17 versus Seattle, 18 versus Carolina, 19 versus Carolina, 19 versus Baltimore, 25 versus Detroit. I like Kyler Murray quite a bit. I think he's one of the safest plays on the slate. He also provides this rushing upside now. He hasn't been running a lot recently, but I should say, he's been running a lot compared to most quarterbacks, but he really hasn't been doing too much in the yards department the past 2 games. But, if you look at week 11 versus San Francisco, he had 8 carries for 67 yards, had a rushing touchdown versus the Rams. He had 5 carries versus San Francisco, 2 carries versus New Orleans, but then 10 carries. This is kind of what I was talking about from recently. He was running quite a bit in this 3-game stretch where he was having some pretty solid fantasy games. So 10 carries, 28 yards, not impressive, but 11 carries, 32 yards. It's not a lot, but it's an extra 3 points. That's almost an extra passing touchdown. 10 carries versus Cincinnati, 93 yards. That's the kind of ceiling I'm looking for. Had a rushing touchdown, 25 fantasy points. Then 4 carries, 8 carries, which is pretty solid. So he's kind of hit or miss in the rushing department, but he's definitely got that upside, which I definitely like out of my quarterback, especially someone that's this cheap. He's not going to get you Lamar Jackson rushing type numbers, but really no one is. So he's kind of like Deshaun Watson, where if he wants to run the ball, he can do it. He can also get those rushing touchdowns. So I'm kind of viewing Kyler Murray as like with Deshaun Watson rushing upside, and he's got the passing upside as well. Obviously, he doesn't have the weapons that he does, and DeAndre Hopkins, Will Fuller, and all those guys. But now Kyler Murray is also coming in about 1,000 cheaper, so definitely like that. And this is a good matchup on the ground if Kyler Murray does decide to take advantage of that. They are 25th DVA versus the run. And also, the Cardinals play at the fastest pace of play in the NFL, about 25 seconds per play ran. So I do think there's a lot of upside in this game. It should be pretty fast-paced, and I think he's just a really solid cash game quarterback this week. Cleveland is middle of the road when it comes to versus the pass. And Arizona is one of the better offensive line versus defensive line pass blocking matchups of the week, which is a rarity for them because the Cardinals have one of the worst offensive lines out of the whole NFL. So if when they get a positive pass blocking matchup, we should probably take advantage of that, especially if he might have some time to throw here. So he's rating out as a really good point per dollar option. So Kyler Murray, definitely someone I don't mind getting in my lineups this week. I think he's very safe. And he also plays at 4 o'clock, and I love having late game exposure. I said that in my other video. But when all my guys play at 1 o'clock, I feel like I'm just at a huge disadvantage. So when I can get a quarterback that starts at 4, I definitely feel pretty safe about that. So Kyler Murray, he's checking all the boxes here. He's got rushing upside. He's got passing upside. He's going to probably be I shouldn't say pass heavy. I mean, they might run the ball quite a bit, but they're going to run a lot of plays. They've just played at such a high, fast pace. Like in the NBA, we're targeting teams that play fast pace. Arizona Cardinals, they played a fast pace. So I do like that. I like the game environment, second highest over-under on the slate. Both teams don't play great defense, so Kyler Murray does make quite a bit of sense. And they are dogs, so I would expect them to have to be throwing the ball quite a bit. Now, onto the running back position. If you can find the salary for Christian McCaffrey, I definitely think you could do so, or plug him in. I have no problem with that. But I personally don't think you have to play Christian McCaffrey this week. Is he my highest projected player on the slate? Yes, but he's also 10K, and I like 2 7K running backs a lot better, so we're going to talk about them right now. So the first guy we're going to plug in is Saquon Barkley here at 7,700. He is probably going to be the highest owned running back on the slate, him and Chris Carson, which we'll talk about Chris Carson in a little bit. It's a little spoiler there, but he's going to be very high owned despite being very disappointing this year. Certainly, he's been he's been pretty rough. But there's nothing like a matchup versus Miami to fix your fantasy season. They've been one of the worst teams in the NFL in pretty much all aspects this season. Now, if you just look at his game log, 9 points, it's pretty rough. 14 points, a little bit better. Got saved in garbage time there versus Green Bay, though. 8 points versus Chicago. 8 points versus the Jets, where he had 13 carries, 1 yard. Versus Dallas, he had 14 carries for 28 yards, 15 points. But then versus Detroit, he had 28 points. Then he had 17 points, then 7, 25, 20. Now, he's been a little worse. Not a little. He's actually been a lot worse after the ankle injury. But he also had a huge game versus Detroit after the ankle injury. So he's capable of big games. It just hasn't really turned into much. But we're going up against Miami, so I do like that. And I also like that Eli Manning is back because this is going to help boost his, just his floor in general for the, in the receiving game because Eli Manning loves dumping the ball off. We know Eli Manning has no problem dumping the ball off 10 plus times to Saquon Barkley. We saw it all the time last season. I have no reason to believe that he won't continue to do so. It really didn't happen in the last game. Really had 4 targets, but they were also winning in that game, which was odd. So really didn't have to dump the ball off to him too much, but he still had over 21 opportunities with 17 carries, 3 receptions, and 4 targets. So I like the volume still, and that's really never going to be an issue with Saquon Barkley. The volume's been there all season. He's still with 7th in touches per game, and it's just such a good matchup versus Miami. They're 29th DVA versus the run, and they're allowing 27.2 points per game to running backs, which is 8th most in the NFL. And, the touches are going to be there. He only has 3 touchdowns on the season, which is really what's been capping his upside. But I do like it that Eli Manning is back. And I think this game's a pretty sneaky, could be a sneaky shootout, to be honest. If Devontae Parker does end up playing, that would obviously help. But as of right now, we have no idea. Pretty much a game time decision. But I believe we have a 47.5 over-under, which is near the highest on the slate. 2 pretty bad defenses, and I think both offenses could honestly compete here. So don't mind getting some exposure to this game, and I definitely want to get Saquon Barkley in my lineups. I think he gets into the end zone. I think he can get over 100 yards. I think this is a big bounce back spot for Saquon. So definitely like him. He's got a high floor, in my opinion, in this matchup. He's going to be very high owned. He's a little cheap at 7,700. Got receiving upside as well, so he makes a ton of sense for me this week. Now, Chris Carson, he's the other guy I'm going to be locking in my lineups. He's 7,500, and he's going to be benefiting from an injury. I said I like guys that are a little cheap, are going to get volume, good matchup, and he's benefiting from an injury, and that's what Chris Carson, he qualifies on all of those boxes. Main thing here, like I said, Rashad Penny is going to be out for the year, so enter bell cow Chris Carson status here. I expect to see the volume to look like what it did earlier in the year, where he was getting 20 plus touches every single game. If we just scroll back to the game log, I mean, start the season 15, 15, 15, but then 22, 27, 24, 21, 20, 16, 25, carries. I mean, he was just getting nearly 30 touches a game because he's also involved in the passing game as well, getting about a handful of targets per game. And I have no reason to expect that won't continue in this game without Rashad Penny. And this is a matchup we've been drooling over for weeks and ever since their bye week versus the Carolina Panthers. They are 32nd DVA versus the run, second worst run D on PFF rankings. They're allowing 30.8 points per game to running backs, which is second most in the NFL. And Seattle's main goal is to run the ball, and when they're able to run the ball, they will do it to until the game's over. I mean, they'll just run the ball. They do not care, and they can definitely do so in this game. They are 5-point favorites here, and I think Carson can have over 100 plus yards and 2 touchdowns. I can honestly see that happening. I don't think that's out of the realm of possibility. So Chris Carson, 7,500. I think he gets 20 plus carries, and honestly, I think he gets about a handful of targets. So if you're going to give me about 25 touches versus the Carolina run defense, which is pretty much the worst in the NFL, and Chris Carson, he's very, very good. He ranks out very high in PFF rankings for elusive rating, rushing grade. He's just broken tackles. So Chris Carson, I think he's an excellent play this week. Doesn't break the bank either. So I feel really safe with the 2 running backs we have in our lineups as of right now. We have SAQUON Barkley. We got Chris Carson. So I like the start to this lineup. And now we're going to head over to the wide receiver position. And I said this guy is pretty much my lock of the week. I have my 2 lock of the week. So I had Chris Carson as a lock of the week, and I also had Chris Godwin as my lock of the week. And we are going to be able to fit him in. And I just don't see how we can get away from him. I believe he's going to be one of the highest owned players on the entire slate. Right up there with SAQUON Barkley, Chris Carson. So I just absolutely love Chris Godwin. I've loved him on Monday. I've wanted to play him ever since. So I'm glad he's going to be able to fit into this example lineup. So unfortunately, Evans is done for the year for you guys that own Evans in your fantasy playoffs. But this means this is a good thing for DFS purposes for Chris Godwin. Evans is leaving behind a 23% target share, 35% market share of the team's air yards. He also had the most air yards in the league by 400 yards, and he was 3rd in receiving yards. That's a lot of production that's gone, and this should benefit the already heavily involved Chris Godwin here. He's going to get all the targets he can handle. It wouldn't surprise me if he honestly got 15 plus targets in this game. That might be a little aggressive, but I could definitely see it happening. And the Lions are allowing the 9th most points per game to wide receivers, so I really like the individual matchup here in the slot versus Justin Coleman. Godwin does run 63% of his snaps out of the slot, and he will be mainly lined up against slot corner Justin Coleman, who is someone we definitely want to target. On Thanksgiving Day, I was all over Anthony Miller on Thanksgiving because he was going to be lining up in the slot most of the time versus Justin Coleman, and he had a huge game. I think he had 150, 160 receiving yards versus him, and he just absolutely ate him up. Justin Coleman, he's allowed 7 touchdowns this year in coverage, which is second most, tied for second most, and he's allowing the 4th most yards per route covered. And Tampa Bay has one of the higher totals on the slate, and I just think Chris Godwin absolutely destroys here. And maybe he busts, but I really just don't see it happening. I honestly think we could see something like the Atlanta game, 8 targets, 184 yards, 7 catches, 40 points. There's no Mike Evans, so we don't have to play the guessing game. Is it going to be a Mike Evans week? Is it going to be a Chris Godwin week? We know it's going to be Chris Godwin this week. If you're going to get me near 15 targets versus the Detroit defense that's been really anything but a defense, I love him this week, so I think we got to plug him in. We got to find the salary for it. So Chris Godwin definitely in my lineup. And Jameis Winston is good to go. I know he's been dealing with the injury, and I don't even think he's throwing a football this week in practice. He's been doing tennis balls, and I think that's nothing. So, but I think he'll be fine. So, Chris Godwin, I love the start to this lineup. So we got Kyler Murray, SAQUON Barkley, Chris Carson, Chris Godwin. Man, this is a really good start to this lineup. And there's a lot of value this week, so it's pretty easy to fit all these studs in. Then we have another stud coming up in Jarvis Landry at 6,700. I just know I'm a Browns fan, so it might be a homer pick, but I really do think he's going to be one of the highest owned wide receivers on the week, and he's just grading out as such a good play, and he's the wide receiver 1 on this offense. He's been better than Odell, and he just has a better connection with Baker, and Odell's hurt, playing with a sports hernia injury, and he's just a much safer play overall. And he's been good pretty much all season, and this matchup I'm just salivating over. So let's just look at the game log. 11 points, 13 points, 39 points. He's not just some safe, like low ceiling play. He has 39 points versus Miami. He's capable of huge games. 14 points, 24 points was great, 17 points, 11 points, 6 points versus Seattle, which I believe was his worst game of the year. And 11 points versus San Francisco, 27 versus Baltimore, 9 versus the Ravens, 6 versus the Jets, 11 versus the Titans. He has been very good all season. I was also reading something from Scott Barrett. I believe he said when Odell is dealing with a like a shadow coverage, Jarvis Landry is averaging 20 points per game, and Odell is going to be on Patrick Peterson, which Patrick Peterson has not been great this year whatsoever, but whenever Odell is dealing with shadow coverage, Jarvis Landry has thrived. So that's another positive for Jarvis Landry, because Odell will be on Patrick Peterson, which really not that intimidating anymore, but I think Odell might have a solid game. But Jarvis Landry, I think he just absolutely smashes. And like I said, this matchup's amazing. He plays the slot about 62% of the time, and 62% of the snaps there. Is a great matchup in the slot versus Arizona. They are allowing 26.2 points per game to slot receivers, which is most in the NFL, and they're allowing the second most points per game in general to wide receivers at over 40 points per game to the position. He's got the highest target share on the team at 26%. So just sign me up for Jarvis Landry this week. I think he absolutely smashes. 6,700. His price has gotten up. I believe this is the most expensive he's been all season by far. I remember the one game was like 4,500 versus Denver, I think. If I can find, yeah, he's 4,500 versus Denver. Fortunately, he's about 2.2k more expensive now, but he's just been so good. I think he's a very safe play this week. I think he gets you near 10 targets, probably around 100 yards. I think he gets into the end zone. So I think he smashes Arizona, and it just makes sense to get exposure to this game because we got the second highest over-under. I think this game's going to be great for fantasy purposes, and I like getting these guys that start at 4 o'clock. And it makes sense to have him in your lineup as well as Kyler Murray, because that's a pretty decent correlation if you think that game's going to pop off. So do like Jarvis Landry. Now, we're going to need a cheap wide receiver at this point, and you can go multiple ways here. So we have only 3,700 left. So actually, what I think we're going to do is we're going to skip the third wide receiver spot first before we go to the tight end position. Because I usually, when I make my lineups, I usually fill out my, these positions first, and then I'll go to my tight end, then I'll probably look at my flex, and I'll see what wide receiver, 3, or defense we have left. So let's skip to the tight end position first. And I think there's just 2 guys you can play in cash this week. I don't see any reason to go any more expensive. So you could go with Tyler Higbee, who I think is an awesome option. Gerald Everett's going to be ruled out, and he's been absolutely smashing. He has, 19 targets the past 2 weeks, 14 catches, over 100 yards, 26 points, 21 points. He's still a little bit too cheap here going up against Dallas. They're allowing the 11th most points per game to the position. And I just think he's a very solid play. He's 3,900. He's a little bit too cheap, but I think there's a cheaper option we can go to who's even in a better matchup. And I will say Tyler Higbee, he's had the 2 best matchups possible for a tight end the past 2 weeks. Arizona's giving up the most points per game. Seattle's giving up the second most points per game. So I'm going to take the guy that's 800 cheaper and also going up against Seattle, and that's going to be Ian Thomas, because Greg Olsen was ruled out. I figured that out when I was recording my video yesterday, and I said, well, Ian Thomas is pretty much my number 1 play at the tight end position now, so we are going to load him up. He had 10 targets last week in the absence of Greg Olsen, 5 catches, got a touchdown, had 16 fantasy points, and Ian Thomas, he's a pretty good wide receiver. He's not just some scrub. He's actually a pretty athletic tight end, and he's had a good connection with Kyle Allen before. He had a good game with him last year, had a great game last week. I just don't see any reason that we wouldn't want to play Ian Thomas here. He's dirt cheap facing Seattle, who's the light version of Arizona. They're allowing 16.8 points per game to tight ends, which is second most in the NFL. I think Ian Thomas is a fantastic play here in cash games, and I see no reason why we can't load him up. So he's someone I'm going to be plugging in at a dirt cheap price point. And they're also 5.5 point dogs, so I would expect them to have me throwing the ball quite a bit. So at this point, we have 3,900 left, which I know doesn't seem like a lot, but trust me, there's a lot of value on this slate that we can make it work for sure. So at flex, I usually like to plug in a running back, which is what we're going to do. Now, there's a lot of cheap wide receivers this week, which I guess I'd have no problem if you want to play them in the flex spot over the running back we're going to talk about, because I don't think he's got the most upside in the world. But just for cash game purposes, I typically like to play 3 running backs. So that's what we're going to talk about. Patrick Laird here at 4,500. Now, I'm not a big fan of this play, but he's really popping up as a pretty solid point per dollar option, so I guess we're going to have to talk about him. He played 82% of the snaps last week. He is the bell cow running back for the Miami Dolphins, which is not a lucrative position, but I think we're going to have to roll with it anyway. They're 11th DVOA versus the run. The Giants are. That's not great. It's just pretty much middle of the road. It's not the best matchup in the world. The Dolphins have one of the worst offensive lines in the NFL. But the thing is, he gets involved in the passing game. He had 5 targets the past 2 weeks. If you can just give me 5 catches for like 40 to 50 yards and maybe he falls into the end zone, gets me 40 rushing yards, I'll take that at this price point, 4,500. I think this game has sneaky shootout potential. I think Larry can get into the end zone, give me 10 plus points, and I will be happy with it. And he is expected to have some pretty high ownership, so it's not just some throwing the dart play. I expect him to be pretty high owned. So Patrick Laird, he does make some sense for me this week. So he's going to be someone we're going to plug in at the flex spot for this example lineup. Now, as for our wide receiver 3 spot, so we're going to be able to fit in one of these cheap guys, and then we'll have just a 3K or something defense left. So there's two guys I'm looking at as of right now. So it's Danny Amendola or it's Chris Conley. I think you can go with either. Chris Conley, I think he's an excellent option. He's going to be extremely high owned, and it's for good reason. DJ Chark is out, and they're going up against the Oakland Raiders, which are one of the worst pass defenses in the NFL. You guys know that. They're allowing they're 31st DVA versus the pass, and they're bottom half in the league versus wide receivers for fantasy points given up. And he played 84% of the snaps last week, despite only seeing 3 targets and no DJ Chark. So he just makes all the sense in the world. So Chris Conley, definitely one of the top plays on the slate for sure for value purposes. But just for this lineup, I have enough salary to go up to Danny Amendola, which they're pretty much the same play to me. But I think Danny Amendola's got safer targets. I will say the upside probably isn't there as Chris Conley, because Chris Conley can hit on the big play. So just know I like both. But let's talk about Danny Amendola. I really think he's a very solid play this week. So no Marvin Jones, definitely going to open up some targets on this offense. He's leaving behind 7 targets per game and a 19% target share. And also TJ Hawkinson is gone as well. So they pretty much have no one else besides Amendola and Kenny Golladay. And he saw 8 targets the past 2 weeks with Marvin Jones playing. So I think he could honestly hit 10 targets in this game. And he gets to face off versus the league worst defense versus fantasy wide receivers versus the Tampa Buccaneers, who are they're a pass funnel defense. They're allowing 48 points per game to the position, wide receivers, which is most in the NFL. Their first DVA versus the run, though, and allowing the 3rd fewest points per game versus the run. And the run game sucks anyway. They got Bo Scarborough, who's just like a grinder. He's just going to take the ball up the middle and pretty much just do that only. So I don't see them having success running the ball. And this game has a decent total. I believe it's at 47.5. So I think Danny Amendola is a fantastic play here. Now, his receptions don't turn into much. His longest catch for the past 2 weeks was 14 yards. Not that exciting. But if he's going to give me like 6 to 8 receptions here, I think it's a pretty solid play for cash games. Now, I don't think he's got the upside Chris Conley has, but I think he's a very safe play. So just for this lineup example, we can plug him in. So at this point, we have 3,100 left, and I know I like the Packers defense this week, so I know I can afford them at this point. You can go with the Vikings versus the Chargers, but I'd rather pick on Mitch Trubisky on the road in Lambeau. It's going to be cold in Lambeau. Well, I would assume it is. I haven't actually checked the weather, but it's December and it's in Lambeau, so I'm assuming it's going to be cold. The Chicago Bears are used to playing on the cold. They're in Chicago. They're not that far away from Lambeau, but still, they're playing at home. I like when the Packers are at home. They have a solid defense. They suck on the run, but it's David Montgomery. I really don't care too much. They're better versus the pass. Mitch Trubisky is prone to mistakes. I'm sure they'll get some sacks. I'm sure he'll turn the ball over. Maybe we get lucky with a scoop and score, maybe a pick 6. So Packers defense, I believe it's only a 40.5 over under, which is one of the lowest on the slate. So I don't think they're a bad defense whatsoever. I think they're a pretty solid option. So we had 100 left, and I think this is a pretty solid cash game lineup example. So we got Kyler Murray. I expect him to be pretty high owned going up against Cleveland. Only 5,600. I think he's got a pretty safe floor there. We got 2 bell cow running backs in Saquon Barkley versus Miami and Chris Carson versus Carolina. 2 of the best matchups you can ask for. They should both get 20-plus touches. Chris Godwin, one of the best fantasy wide receivers this season. No Mike Evans going against Detroit. That gets destroyed by slot receivers. Jarvis Landry going up against Arizona, who gets destroyed by slot receivers, and he's going to avoid Patrick Peterson. He should thrive here. 6,700, one of the safer plays on the board. Danny Amendola versus Tampa Bay. No Marvin Jones, no TJ Hawkinson. They get shredded by wide receivers. So Danny Amendola makes sense as a nice, just a nice salary option to end your lineup. Ian Thomas, no Greg Olsen. You should see near double-digit targets in this game. I expect them to be trailing. It's a great matchup versus Seattle. Patrick Laird. He fits. I like this game for fantasy purposes. He catches passes. He could flirt with 20 touches in this game, so I don't mind using him. Then the Packers defense, they fit at the end. They're a solid price going against Mitch Trubisky at home, so 3K, not the worst defense in the world. So there it is. There's an example cash game lineup build. Again, don't just take this lineup and put it in all of your contests. I want you guys to make your own lineups, and it's just more fun to make your own lineups. It's fun to win off your own plays. Well, you can use some of my plays, but you can also just mix and match some of your guys' as well, and you can guys use this same exact process I use by getting guys that are going to get volume, good matchups, decent prices as well. Alright guys, that's going to be it. I hope this video was helpful. If it was, remember to leave a like. If you're new to the channel, hit that subscribe button. Really helps me out. Really appreciate it. You can also follow me on Twitter at ChrisManel16, and I'll see you guys in the next video.